this video, I'm going to go over a lecture in a series of lectures that I want to create called Psychology 101. So along with a lot of other content on my YouTube channel where I'm diving deep into Carl Jung, I thought that I would create a series on Psychology 101 to kind of get a broader perspective of psychology as a general discipline. So as we're learning deep in one area, we're also kind of, having a broader perspective of things that have happened since Jung. Okay, and so this is part of a bigger project in my personal life. Me creating this YouTube channel is kind of connected to this personal idea I have called the library of my mind. And so I'm going into, I'm basically trying to study different fields and disciplines systematically. And where I've started is in psychology. And so I'm passionate about learning different ideas. And so I've started in the field of psychology, and I've obviously started with Carl Jung as a person and around his ideas. But at the same time, I want to, get up to speed on psychology as a general discipline as well. And, I'm going to go deep into Carl Jung, really deep, and go through every single thing in his collected works. But I also want to, at the same time, spread out and move just beyond just psychodynamic principles and learn about cognitive psychology, the behaviorists, and, all different range of perspectives. So in this video, what you're going to learn is we're going to go through these 4 different things, okay? We're going to talk about psychology as a discipline and introduce positive psychology, which is a different kind of perspective on psychology. It's more recent. And then we're going to go through the boundaries and borders of psychology. So, what's the boundaries and borders of the actual psychology as a discipline? And then we're going to go through a bit of the history of psychology, how its kind of origins and how it kind of started. And then the main part of this video is going to be different perspectives in psychology. Okay, so just a very broad overview snapshot of 5 different perspectives. Now, there's obviously more than just 5 perspectives, but this is just a Psychology 101 introductory primer for people. Okay, so this whole series is just going to be, the very bare basics, so we can build precepts upon precepts. So, and we can understand concept better if we understand just the raw basics of them. Okay, and so those 5 perspectives are the psychodynamic perspectives, mainly to do with originating through Freud, but I also throw in Jung there. And then the behaviorist perspective, mainly B.F. Skinner, and the humanistic perspective with Maslow, and the cognitive psychology, and then finally evolutionary psychology. Okay, and so I got the idea to do this lecture series from this textbook. I'll actually show you the textbook. So this is the textbook I'll be using. So everything I'm presenting to you in this video is from this textbook. Okay, so I'm probably going to create about 13 different Psychology 101 videos, okay, all based on different chapters in this textbook, okay? And so I just want to draw out different principles from the text so we can get a balanced understanding of psychology. So let's get into it. So psychology and positive psychology. So I think they put this in the textbook to kind of show that there's differing perspectives and different emphasis on how we can approach psychology from the get-go. But traditionally, I guess we focused on mental illnesses. So, different types of personality disorders, other various conditions, mental conditions, pathology, and problems. So when someone has a problem or a mental illness, we then, based on their manifesting symptoms, such as depression or certain types of behavior, then we kind of attend to people and their disorders. And we still very much look at it this way. A lot of clinical psychology is focused on mental illness, and rightfully so, because mental illness is prevalent. It is something that needs to be attended towards in our society. So we do need to know how to deal with mental illness on a one-on-one basis, but also just in general in society. But the positive psychology perspective is kind of focuses on mental health and mainly subjective well-being. So well-being is a term that you'll hear a lot. And a lot of that is in recent years is championed through the positive psychology paradigm. Okay, so and also tied to the idea of flourishing, because positive psychology is focused on the well-being of a particular individual and helping them flourish. So not just focusing on their illnesses or focusing on problems, but focusing on their strength, focusing on their character strengths, being proactive, using positive emotions, using different sets of things such as creativity, wisdom, these character strengths, which actually Martin Seligman has some excellent material on character strengths. I've read a bit of it, and I do think that it's, it seems pretty good to me. I mean, why not figure out what type of strengths you have and try to capitalize on them to create and promote, more well-being in your life, to help further the development of who you can become, to maximize your potential in life, to create further kind of buffers between you and falling down into, into maybe what could be a serious mental illness. Because sometimes mental illness can be circumstantial as well. I mean, obviously there's the biological component, but then also, circumstances in life, being beat down by life. If you kind of have these character strengths or these buffers in place, that these beneficial factors that help you through life, then you can, not only kind of, get over, say, a depressive spell that you have, but you can also begin to build your life in such a way where you are now expanding and flourishing. So what do you do once you've kind of dealt with your mental illness? So you just blank, like just a blank slate, well, I'm not really depressed anymore, but I also don't have much positive emotion in my life. You see, so that's what positive psychology is about. It's about harnessing those strengths and building upon, once you've kind of reached a level where you're dealing with your mental illnesses, or if you never really had mental illness, now what do you do from that baseline? You build upon your strengths, you build upon who you are to make yourself more effective so you can flourish in the world. So this here, the main figures, like I said, Martin Seligman and Mihaly. I'm not going to pronounce his last name because I'll just butcher it. It's a pretty difficult last name to pronounce. But here we go. Here's a quote from them. The field of positive psychology as the subjective level is about, at the subjective level, is about valued subjective experience, well-being, contentment and satisfaction in the past, hope and optimism for the future, and flow and happiness in the present. Okay, so that's what it's about. And Mihaly does some excellent work on creativity and flow. So if you want to look into him, he's got great work on those two areas in particular. You would have heard of flow. It's a pretty famous concept now, being in the flow. So stuff like that is really good from positive psychology. So now we're going to move on to psychology and the boundaries of psychology, namely that of, the micro level of biology all the way to the macro level of culture. Okay, so the boundaries and borders of psychology mainly rest between biology and culture. Okay, so in biology, obviously, a lot of our psychology is based on the biological structure, so the brain structure. So how different neurons and their networks operate will influence our experience in our psychological experience. Okay, so our psychological experience is deeply linked into our brain structure. So even though it can be hard to localize certain regions of the brain that impact certain functions of our psychology, so they can, localize certain functions, but it's more proper to look at it as each function is distributed throughout the entire brain. Okay, so it's not like one little section does memory and then one little section, is there for motor actions. It's like it is like a network distributed throughout your brain. Okay, even though some parts tend to, like the visual stuff tends to be near the back of the brain and stuff like that, but it's complicated. Okay, so for Psych 101, all we need to know is that our psychology is dependent a lot on the neurons in our brain structure. Okay, and so whereas obviously, so a good example here to contrast them would be love. Okay, so an infant, its love for its mother is derived through emotional states that can be substantiated at the level of biology in the brain structure. Okay, so the animal has certain emotions which bond it with its mother. Okay, and so that's all a biological process. All right, whereas how they express that love is cultural. So there's different kind of ways of expressing the biological substrate, and so those things are cultural. Another example would be algebra. Okay, so a young child wouldn't have developed its brain structure in such a way where it can understand abstract thought well enough to grasp the concepts of algebra. Okay, so that is a biological reason why a child wouldn't understand algebra. But we know throughout culture, if you grew up in the whole history of humanity before algebra arose in the human tradition, you wouldn't have been exposed to algebra as a concept. So you never would have understood it, even though you had the biological capacity. You see, so psychology is a discipline which is bound between these two things. On one end, biology and the limitations of the human structure, and on the other end, culture and how culture and cultural influences on society. And so in the field of psychology, we have different disciplines. We've got biopsychology, or we have something called behavioral psychology, behavioral neuroscience. And then there's cross-cultural psychology. And so they're focusing on the difference between universal principles and specific cultural differences and influences on different groups of psychology. Okay, so that's basically the borders and the boundaries of psychology and the limitations of our inquiry. Actually, I was just rubbing this off here, but I just wanted to point out that if you've watched my other video, my latest video on Carl Jung, where I talk about the 4 stages of life, you'll realize that he also talks about biology and culture, because he's talking about the collective unconscious versus kind of like the collective consciousness. Okay, so he's talking about the unconscious and the instincts versus the conscious and rationality. Okay, and so you can also see his thought also, in a sense, was bounded by this dichotomy as well, although in a different kind of way. namely the unconscious and conscious. And so I think that is also very interesting too, just a little tidbit there for anyone who was following my previous videos. So let's move on to the history of psychology, how it kind of started. And it basically started through philosophy. So philosophy, well, everything in psychology was in psychology was a part of philosophy back in the day, okay, and then it kind of split off from philosophy and made its own kind of niche, discipline, okay. But you can see different strands of psychology in specific major philosophical debates throughout history, and one of them would be free will versus determinism. Okay, so how much do we actually have agency, from our mind over our actions? Okay, and so someone like Rene Descartes would say that your actions are, determined from your inner intentions. Okay, I think, therefore I am, sums up, Rene Descartes' position of, I am me, this mind, and I can do this and do that, right? Whereas the Greek philosopher Democritus saw us and everything else in the world as influenced by under certain laws. So human behavior is influenced inwardly through our biology and outwardly through the environment. So we don't really have free will. Okay. So that's just one little thing. There's also the mind-body problem is another popular philosophical debate. And so, how can mental intentions or something that's not physical, like the mental psychology of something, how can that influence and act on physical components in the body, and, vice versa, okay? And so they're kind of the beginnings, the beginnings of psychology were in philosophy and in different perspectives, kind of philosophizing about the mind and the body and different elements about psychology through that lens. And then basically through the explosion of science in other areas, so in physics, it seemed as if they understood a lot about how, the laws of the physical universe operated. And so they thought, okay, well, why can't we apply this to psychology? Why can't we apply this to our mental processes and understand it? If physicists can understand the atom, why can't we understand the human mind and take more of a scientific approach, as well as also doing experiments? So then we kind of broke off from just philosophy, and William Wundt, that's an awesome name, Wilhelm Wundt, is that type of name that you just want to like crack a whip after, But he founded the first psychology laboratory in Leipzig in Germany, okay? And so he did these experiments, which he called introspection, okay? So he basically got people to, he would present them with different stimuli or different things and ask them different questions. He would get them to introspect and basically verbally respond with what they experienced, like instantly, considering certain stimuli or questions and stuff like that, okay? And so he found that primarily, because he wanted to find the fundamentals, of what made up the psyche, okay, if you will, similar to, the fundamentals in other things, other disciplines like chemistry and stuff like that. He wanted to find the fundamentals of our psychology. And so he thought, okay, well, one of the fundamentals seems to be color, because people describe color and they also describe their emotions a lot. So these seems to be these fundamental elementary components of our psychology. Okay, so, but Wilhelm Wundt also thought that, that psychology could be understood not just through experiments, but through other things, such as the study of mythology and religions. So I found that really interesting too, because Jung obviously takes that route as well. So I'd like to explore that deeper to see who came up with that idea first of understanding psychology through the lens of studying ancient cultures, because I think that's an interesting idea in itself. But then a follower of Wilhelm was Edward Titchener, and he made structuralism. So he was more hard-lined than Wilhelm. He basically wanted to create similar to the periodic table in chemistry. He wanted to create a periodic table of human consciousness. And so he believed that you could only understand psychology by doing experiments, and that no other form of psychology, like comparative religion, studies of that sort, were really valid or anything like that. So he focused on an idea called structuralism. And so, with structuralism, he basically wanted to find out, as I said, the periodic kind of the actual structure of consciousness, I guess. And then later, people moving on from Edward would be even more hardlined, and they would say, well, we can't even understand anything about, the human mind, because it's all subjective. We can only understand behavior and stuff like that. Okay, so, but then in contrast to all of that, William James, he basically, he had another stream of thought called functionalism. Okay, and so functionalism is understanding how a particular psychological process functions, and how it functions in relationship to the human being adaptive to the world. And so there was a usefulness to each particular function because human beings had to adapt. And so his thinking really grounded in his philosophy of pragmatism links into Charles Darwin's understanding of evolutionary theory, and so William James and his basically pioneered the idea of functionalism. So there was the two camps. There was structuralism on the one hand, which was just mainly doing experiments, and then there was functionalism, which looked at not just merely explaining, not just merely describing what someone was experiencing in an experiment, like, I'm seeing colors, I'm, hearing sounds or whatever, but actually not just describing, not just describing, but explaining how a certain particular process, psychological process, functions, and why it kind of functions in that way, considering the adaptive abilities of the human mind. For example, why would a human being, when it sees a snake, immediately jump away or something like that, as opposed to when it sees a flower randomly? It's like, oh, I see a flower, well, great, I'm not going to jump away. But when I see a snake, that image somehow impacts me. So there's a function in my mind that kicks in certain reflexes towards a particular predatory animal. And so, there's these, and we've kind of adapted, our psychology has adapted to, certain images triggering certain processes and functions in the mind. Okay. And then a manifestation of behavior that follows that. So they're the two major schools in the beginnings of psychology: structuralism, and functionalism. And so now we're going to move on to the 5 different perspectives that I'm going to outline, 5 contrasting perspectives in psychology. All right, guys, so I'm back from work. I had to actually go to work and come back and finish this. So I'm going to finish this. But while I was at work, I thought to myself, I don't think I explained this well enough. Titchener's structuralism uses wants introspection to do the experiments. Okay, so that they're like linked together. All right, and also William James, he's like a boss dog. I can't wait. I think he wrote the first textbook of psychology, pretty much. It's like a big, thick 2 volumes. I really want to get into William James. He also, is a part of pioneering the philosophy pragmatism. And so I want to learn about William James's understanding of pragmatism. Obviously, also Jordan Peterson refers to William James a lot too, and he just seems like an awesome character to learn about. So we'll be doing that. So let's move on now to the 5 different perspectives. All right, the psychodynamic perspective. So largely this perspective is originated from Sigmund Freud and his psychoanalysis. And so he kind of was the pioneer in this field, a giant in this field. He pioneered psychoanalysis. And so he wasn't the first to discover a lot of these ideas, but he popularized these ideas. So he made the idea of the unconscious popular so that, it became more of a well-known theory. He also had, obviously his specific theories as well. But what underlies psychoanalysis are 3 presumptions. Okay, the first is that our actions are determined by our psychodynamics. So how our feelings, thoughts, and wishes are connected to each other or arranged in our psyche. The dynamics of our feelings and thoughts in our mind, those dynamics impact our actions in the real world. So, if we can go through a psychoanalysis or a therapy and uncover some underlying wishes that we have, we might then be able to consciously integrate them and so rearrange how our thoughts and feelings are connected in our mind. And so rearrange the psychodynamics, the dynamics of our psychology, and then that rearranging then changes our actions or helps us in our life. So, so our actions are determined by psychodynamics. There are unconscious mental events. So most of these psychodynamics are unconscious. So we're not conscious of the dynamic of our psyche, of how different thoughts and feelings and repressions are kind of linked with other conscious manifestations of our behavior. Okay, so a lot of these psychic events are unconscious, and they're competing motives. So we might both like and hate someone at the same time. So it's not just a simple black and white thing. It's a complex interplay and integration of different motivations, the sexual motivations and aggression and stuff like that. Okay, so Freud's theories are, largely obviously focused on the sex principle. So Freud's ideas are largely, built upon the sex principle as well as aggression as well. But a lot of the psychodynamic stuff the data comes from case study methods. Okay, so it's a case study because a lot of the work is clinical. They're Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, they're all clinicians. So it's the data they get through interacting with their patients. And so that's a very good thing because they're looking at the whole personality of the person. They're talking with them, day in and day out, and they're understanding who this person is, their past, their present situation, so they get to build a theory based on all the different elements of this person instead of just applying some random, method to this person and hoping that it helps them, right? They're actually attending to the person themselves right in front of them and dealing with the issue that is presenting in this particular person's life. Okay, so because in psychodynamics, people reveal themselves in everything they do. That's the important line. People reveal themselves in everything they do. So the way they speak, to their body language, to the things they say. That's why there's a thing called the Freudian slip, because I might mean to say one thing, but I accidentally say another thing. So that is an indication that I am actually thinking about something else. And it could be unconscious, a lot of these thoughts that I'm having. So, I accidentally say, let's sex this up, instead of saying, let's set this up. So, then whoever I'm setting it up with, maybe I want to get frisky with them or something like that. So there's that inference is made in the psychoanalytic perspective, okay? And there's tells, so little movements or gestures or ideas or dreams. These are all telling of something else or indicative of some other underlying motive. And we have to make inferences to discover those things. But in general, the person who you're talking with, they could, if it resonates with them and they go, now that you say that, that makes sense. So there is a validation in that sense, that it resonates with the person receiving the therapy. Because if it didn't resonate at all, then it's kind of like the person's just making stuff up. But so in my opinion, there is definitely some way to kind of validate it in that sense. If it works, if it's working for the person, then it is effective and it is helping them. Although in the textbook, it did say that psychoanalysis is more effective over a year or longer. So it actually takes quite a long time for the benefits to be seen with this approach to psychology, because it does take a long time to talk with someone and understand their story and kind of get comfortable with each other. So I can imagine that can be quite costly. And I just want to read out these principles here, key propositions of psychoanalytic theory. There's 5 of them. Number 1 is enduring aspects of personality begin to emerge in childhood, and childhood experiences play an important role in personality development, shaping the ways people form later social relationships. So our childhood is very important in this perspective. Particularly in Freud's perspective. I know that Jung sees it a little bit differently, but anyway, it's a common thing. It's all of Freud's ideas are being disseminated into our culture, so it's a very common thing for people who aren't even doing anything to do with psychology to be like, something bad happened to your childhood and now that's influenced you now. That's a very common way of thinking about people's problems and the things that they're manifesting in their present, that it may be indicative of something that happened in their childhood. And number 2, there's mental representations of self, others, and relationships guide people's interactions with others and play a substantial part in many forms of psychopathology. So their mental representation of themselves and others. So it's basically talking about projection there, I think. They're projecting a certain image or characterization that they have onto other people, and the way they self-identify all impacts how they actually relate with the world, because that perception can be skewed, it can be inaccurate. And so number 3, mental processes, including affective and motivational processes, operate simultaneously and in parallel, so that individuals can have conflicting feelings towards the same person or situation and can craft compromises outside of awareness. So they could be unconscious of multiple different feelings they have towards people and emotions that they hold towards people. They actually feel angry, but you're not really even conscious that you're angry at your grandma for doing something because, oh, poor grandma, she's lovely. But really she's annoying and she's a windbag and she gas all day and, does all these things that annoy you, but you aren't conscious of your own feelings towards how much you really hate your grandma, but you hate her, all right? You just, stuff like that, right? So it's these little interplays between people where you can discern motives, underlying motives, okay? So then personality development involves not only learning to regurgitate, not only learning to regulate sexual and aggressive feelings and wishes, but also moving from an immature dependent state to mature independent one. Okay, so it's about maturing the personality as a whole as well. And number 5, much of life is unconscious. So that is the major emphasis in this psychodynamic perspective is the unconscious dynamics of the psyche. Okay, so there was also this interesting point here. Several studies have documented that people who avoid conscious awareness of their negative feelings are at increased risk for a range of health problems such as asthma, heart disease, and cancer. So suppressing those negative feelings, people who are unconscious of them are at increased risk of these illnesses. So that's more of a recent research on that, and so that's interesting. And so there's lots of other validation of the effectiveness of the psychodynamic perspective. Gaskin's review also supports the use of psychodynamic psychotherapy for generalized anxiety disorder. So it can be helpful for quite a lot of things as well. And yes, long benefits are seen more longer term in this thing. But now some of the criticisms are, because it just relies on case studies, that it's it can't be falsifiable. Like, these ideas aren't really falsifiable because you can't prove them wrong, so to speak. So that, and I guess the criticisms of this perspective would be that it doesn't really apply a rigorous standard in regards to the scientific method. So it's not really like implementing the scientific method and testing and retesting, falsifiable data that can be, continuously tested again, because these are just kind of independent case studies, of various different clients. And so that would be some of the criticisms. It also says here that there's a lack of scientific grounding and empirical evidence for key ideas. So that would make sense. There's a lack of, empirical evidence. But what's interesting about Carl Jung actually is he tries to use mythology and all the ancient religions as a kind of empirical evidence for the layers of the psyche. So where Jung's criticism of Freud was that Freud had a purely individualistic approach, and Jung said that man is not born a blank slate, basically. Man is born with a particular structure and has a particular history. And so we need to consider that history when we're considering the psyche. And so Jung does use a kind of empiricism, but it's not the same kind as, say, just like a straight behavioralist approach where you set up an experiment, because Jung isn't involved with, doing experimentation like that. And so I guess the criticism towards that would still be that it's a retrospective analysis of things. And so that could be considered a weakness, I guess, there. So it's interesting to see the interplay between different perspectives here. So now we're going to move on to the behaviorist perspective. The behaviorist perspective. So the behaviorists, they viewed basically, they want to create a new kind of perspective on what psychology should be. And their perspective was that we should observe the environmental impact on the behavior, on observable behavior of a particular animal or a human, right? So they're looking at the relationship between the environment and behaviors. Okay, so the whole science of behaviorism is based on observing behavior and observing changes in behavior, and so that's what they call learning. So if there's a change in a behavior because of a certain environmental event, then the organism has learned something from that. Okay, so major figures are John Watson, B.F. Skinner, Ivan Pavlov. So it kind of started with Ivan Pavlov and Pavlov's dogs, if you kind of know about that famous story. He was studying the digestive system of dogs and accidentally stumbled upon one of his dogs salivating towards a particular sound. And so, this spurred him into further investigation. And basically with Pavlov's dogs, he ran an experiment, and he basically found out that you could condition these dogs to salivate by linking the stimulus of food to a sound stimulus, a different stimuli, and even when you take away the food, you could still ring the bell and the dog would still salivate. And so he hypothesized that it was a stimulus theory, that the dog associated the stimulus of the bell with the meat coming, and so that's why the dog salivated. There's other theories. There's a stimulus to reflex theory as well, that the stimulus caused just the reflex in the mouth for the dog to salivate. But that kind of then ignores the linking of the timing of the stimulus to indicate that the meat is coming, the other stimulus is coming. So we'll get more into that properly, and I'll outline that more specifically in another 2 videos. So I'm going to make another Psychology 101 video about learning, and basically that just covers the whole behavioralist perspective. Okay, so we're going to go over that in great detail. But these are the main figures. They mainly rely on experimentation, so a rigorous application of the scientific method. So they want to be able to repeat experiments. They want to be able to falsify their hypothesis. And so they basically treat the mind as a black box. So there's no going there. They basically say that it's unscientific to look at any mental process or any mental state. So they completely reject the psychodynamic perspective, because how can you, validate your hypothesis, or if it's just if you can't observe the mental states of a person, it's just subjective. Okay, so that's why they heavily rely on experimentation, because you can set up an experiment with a particular hypothesis, test to see if that environmental event does impact the behavior of an animal in a certain way. If it does, then we can prove and see and observe the changes in behavior. And when you start reading the Behaviorist Perspective, it is quite powerful. You especially see how powerful it is when it comes to things like gambling behaviors and addiction to gambling. These things are very powerful perspectives, and I think that they're very important to learn. So even beyond the Psychology 101 lecture, in the future, after I've done a large portion of Jung and Freud and all that, I would like to learn more, particularly about the behavioralist perspective, because I do think that they have something very valuable to offer, because it's just so rigorous, the way that they approach it. And I think that that's good. But then that's also a weakness, because, obviously there are mental events. It's not just a black box. We do have, a mental life. And a lot of behavioralists would acknowledge that, but they just would say that you can't scientifically study it, and so the psychology of the science of psychology has to be limited to observable behavior. Okay, to outline some of that, check this out. Okay, B.F. Skinner. Okay, this is a quote from him: "There is no place in a scientific analysis of behavior for a mind or a self." Okay, so there's just no place for it. And also John Watson, a pioneer of American behaviorism, considered mental events entirely outside the province of scientific psychology. So there you go. That's their views on it. And Ivan, I'm not completely sure, but he discovered it. So classical conditioning basically is what Ivan Pavlov discovered. And B.F. Skinner also focused on reinforcement and punishment as well. And we'll get more into that on our Psychology 101 on learning. And so, we'll get more into some of those experiments too, and pigeons and stuff like that. So that's all fun. Now, so the behavioralists attempted to counter Cartesian dualism, the doctrine of dual spheres of mind and body, by demonstrating that human conduct follows laws of behavior, just as the law of gravity explains why things fall down instead of up. Okay, so that's just reinforcing that point. And so, Watson and all this, they all criticized psychodynamics. They criticized even introspection, the earlier work with Want, because it wasn't really, again, it was trying to understand the inner workings of the mind, and they didn't think that was a scientifically valid enterprise. So what else here? So basically it's things like, say, for example, you went through a really bad breakup, right? And you were in a particular restaurant, this Italian restaurant. This guy breaks up with you, or this girl breaks up with you, you're just wrecked. You didn't see it coming. It was just slammed in your face, and you're like, oh no. 2 years later, you're driving with your new partner, your new girlfriend or boyfriend, and they say to you, oh, I want to go to that restaurant. And then you get these negative feelings, and you're like, oh, and then you avoid that restaurant, and you say, no, I don't want to go there. Now, what influenced that person's behavior was that they've learned through conditioning. They were conditioned by the negative stimuli of a previous breakup to adjust their behavior in their future relationship. So now they're not going to go to that restaurant anymore because they've associated something negative to that restaurant. Okay, so that's just like a simple example there of how it would impact humans and stuff like that. And so obviously cognitive psychology kind of built, expanded this, because now we can actually examine, get pictures of the brain when it lights up and stuff like that, and try to understand how the actual brain is being impacted uh, through certain events in the environment and stuff like that. So that's kind of like we've gone beyond the behavioralist perspective because it kind of fell out of favor. It was kind of prominent between 1920s and 1960s, and then it kind of fell out of favor because we got interested in mental states again. Thank God. So, but there's a lot to learn from this perspective, and I think that it's very important. And I like learning about it. I think it's great. But I do want to also see how we've progressed since then as well. The humanistic perspective got milk because you want to get that cream, baby. Anyway, I forgot to say that each of these perspectives have this like kind of corny, analogy to them. So the humanistic perspective would be that the cream always rises to the top. All right. So that's what this is all about. It's about self-actualization, achieving your full potential. That's what you need to do. You're a complete individual with, personal goals and desires and specific experiences that have shaped you. And you want to achieve certain things in your life. And you are motivated to become who you really want to become. And it doesn't matter about the environment or what's influencing you, despite your environment, despite being raised in a single mother family, I will rise up and make YouTube videos. So that is, a little bit of the humanistic perspective there. Self-actualization. There's an assumption that everyone is inherently good, so they inherently are driven to self-actualize, to become better and improve their lives in this kind of self-directed, goal-orientated space where they're constantly improving and wanting to better themselves. And so, and it's distinctly human. Instead of thinking how we related to animals and stuff like that, it's about, how is our, what's the meaning we have in our life as like a human in this human experience that we all have. And it's largely people focus on the uniqueness of the individual, on their self-concept and on their ideal self. And that's where the discrepancy comes in how they view themselves, where they're at now, and how they view where they want to be or who they want to become. And that discrepancy there is how the humanistic, kind of practitioners help their clients to, overcome their obstacles to become who they really want to be in life. And so, this includes Carl Rogers, his approach with the, unconditional regard, which is basically like this kind of radical kind of acceptance, which validates the other person and allows them to kind of open up and be themselves and trying to enable them to become the best person that they can be. That's what you want to be, the best person that they can be. Obviously, Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, at the top, it's self-actualization. So obviously we need all these other things, but ultimately it's all leading towards self-actualization, becoming the best we can be in our life. And so that sums the humanistic perspective up. And in case you're wondering the other corny analogies for the other two perspectives, psychodynamic is basically, the analogy is a big, massive iceberg, and you can only see the top of it, okay? Because the rest is unconscious, all right? That's the analogy for the psychodynamic perspective. For the behavioralist perspective, the analogy is that we're kind of like robots. We just respond to kind of commands via the environment. It wasn't a very good analogy, really, that one. I like this one. The cream always rises to the top, baby. That's a great one. That's great. All right, so let's move on to the next one, the cognitive perspective. So in cognitive psychology, we're not only studying behavior, but we're also now again studying the mental processes. So as the behavioralists limited themselves to behavior, the cognitive perspective expands itself to mental processes again. And largely it's because of the revolution of the computer, right? So because of our technology has advanced, we can actually study the brain more in depth. And so we can understand mental processes, we're more informed of those mental processes. And so basically they do rely a lot on experimentation as well. But they make, in cognitive psychology, they make an inference, because you always have to make an inference when you're dealing with a mental process. But it would be impossible to study memory without this perspective. So a lot of our studies on memory come from the cognitive perspective. So, for example, there was, a study done where a woman, this lady showed, all these patients, all these test subjects, over 100 images, and then 48 weeks later tested them to see how many they remembered. And so they were able to, above chance, they were able to remember which ones they had seen before, as opposed to new ones that were shown that they hadn't seen before. So that's kind of like a little simple test on memory, right? And so there's many. I'm going to make another Psychology 101 video specifically on memory, so we'll get all into it, working memory and distinctions between working memory and long-term memory, and how they came to those distinctions through experimentation and stuff like that. Okay, so the cognitive perspective involves mental processes, so the way people perceive, process, and retrieve information. So it's very kind of information based. The analogy would kind of be computer software or computer processing, information processing, not just like a robot or a computer, but like a software, so how the mind actually processes certain events, and that's important. So a prime example is memory. Okay, and so they also take a rationalist approach as well, not just an empirical approach. The behavioralists would just be straight empirical, but the cognitive approach is built on that empirical research. But also they believe in a rationalist approach, that we can come to knowledge through rationalization without just experience. So which would be empiricism. So it's a combination of empiricism and rationalism. Okay, because we've got to make an inference based on our observations of what is happening, and so we do that through our rationality. Okay, so that's basically that. There's also another kind of modified analogy. Instead of the analogy of we are like computers with software, we are more like the mind is kind of like the brain. Okay, so the analogy, instead of the mind is like a computer, the mind is like the brain, and that's because we can now see the brain, and it's like these neurons. This architecture of neurons scattered throughout, the brain. And so we can understand the mind through the analogy of how we understand the brain. Obviously, most people probably don't understand the brain very well, so it's a pretty poor analogy for them. But for the scientists in this field, they heavily, want to research the brain function and brain processes. So, we're moving towards kind of learning more about the brain as we go, even though we still don't really understand a lot of it as well, because it's so complex that we just, we don't always understand how these things work. But over time, I'm guessing we will continue to expand our understanding in this area. And so since I think the 1960s, or, after the behaviorist perspective kind of went down, there was the humanistic perspective, but then, the cognitive perspective came up again, mainly because of increases in technology, which allowed us to, have scans of brain activity and stuff like that. So that's that perspective. Now we're going to move on to the evolutionary perspective. All right, the last one, the evolutionary perspective. Okay, so basically, This all comes from Charles Darwin, Darwinism. So he wasn't the first to posit evolution, but he was the first to provide a mechanism, namely natural selection as the mechanism. And so basically, it's natural because the environment, basically wipes out those who don't have adaptive traits according to that environment. So those who can adapt to a particular environment then survive, and those who can't, they don't survive. And so then those adaptive abilities get passed on to the next generation of of beings that exist, and then that chain continues on, over across millions of years, and so many. So the assumption is that many behavioral tendencies evolved as they helped our ancestors survive and adapt. Okay, and so it's not just the behavior, but also different, mental states and stuff like that also would have helped us to adapt as well. So it's deductive. So as in it uses something that has already happened. So the past, something's already happened, and we try to explain how that happened using our logic and our understanding of evolution to see how this thing came about. So it's criticized for that because it's kind of retrospectively looking at things and then trying to apply logic onto it, with the assumption that natural selection, would produce a certain way of being, a certain behavior. And so, but more recently, they are trying to also use this knowledge and then subjugate it to certain tests and experiments. And so one of them is basically, I think they predicted using the evolutionary perspective. They predicted that a father's father would be less emotionally close to its grandchild. Okay, and so that's based on the behavior. What they would know through survival would be that a father wouldn't have as much knowledge or certainty if it was the proper parent of its child, whereas the mother knows for sure because the mother is shooting out the child. So then obviously the father's father would have a less emotional bond because of that. And so that's all kind of that dynamic of the family is explained through this kind of evolutionary model. And so they tested all that and it did come out true. Okay, so that's just an example there of emotional closeness and stuff like that. But they have other examples like why do we develop eyes and stuff like that, 2 eyes instead of 1. And it's like, well, 2 eyes so we can have depth, and distance, so it's stuff like that. So that's the evolutionary perspective. They basically are just, explaining how, not just, also trying to see how cognitive processes evolved and how certain behaviors evolved. And so that's a big part of understanding us as animals as well. So I think that's an important perspective that we have to take into consideration as well. So that is it. I'm going to leave it there. That's Psychology 101, the first lecture, the science of psychology. So the next lecture, I'm going to talk about research methods in psychology. And then I think the third one is going to be learning. So that's the behavioralist stuff. And then the fourth one, I'm going to do on memory. And then the fifth one, I'm going to do on the biological basis of mental life and behavior. And so that's going to be more, biology stuff, neurons and stuff like that. So I'm going to continue. I'm probably going to make about 12 or 13 of these Psychology 101 videos. And I'm going to continue to release Jung videos in between as well, because I'm still doing that. And so if you like this video, please subscribe, please give me a like, and share this or share any of my videos with your friends and family. Share me on Facebook, because that really helps my channel grow and get out there. And so thanks for watching, guys. And sorry for the lighting. I'm still trying to work it all out. I started this video in the morning, and so I had the sun there, and now it's nighttime, and I've got the, just the lights on here. So I'm going to try to work it all out. But thanks for staying with me, and I hope you've learned something, and we'll continue this process of studying psychology and learning as much as we can as we create the library in our minds. So I love learning. I think that, we should all become self-learners, and that, we can kind of cultivate that hunger for learning more, and just that curiosity of life. And that's what drives me to make all these videos. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.